Hello, today I'm reviewing the Lethal Skates, the brand new glass mouse feet from Lethal Gaming Gear. Glass skates like these are the new shiny thing on the market, and people have been hyping them up a lot, so I've been pretty excited to try them out. And after using them for a while, I can say that I do like them, but I don't necessarily think that they are better than traditional skates. I do not think that these are going to be the future of mouse feet and you're not going to see them in every mouse. PTFE will probably still be the industry standard. Instead, what they do is offer a different experience that is suitable for different tastes. If you don't vibe with this unique feel, you could very easily hate these. But if they do fit you, they can offer a very cool experience that feels high performing. These do have the potential to improve your play, genuinely. So I want to take some time to break down how these new skates actually perform in detail to try to help you guys figure out if these could be a good fit for you personally. Because you do have to be a little bit careful when it comes to products this unique, and I want to make sure that you guys are informed before you make a purchase decision. Alright, let's get into it. So, where I want to start here is how these feel and perform in-game. The most important part about Lethal Skates is how they eliminate almost all static friction. On the first day I got this, I noticed that my mouse would actually slide around on my desk if I was using a faster pad. This has never happened to me before, and I had to re-level my desk to eliminate this problem. So this is a truly uniquely low amount of static friction. This feeling is also not pad dependent either. No matter what you use, it'll be very easy to make these small interhand motions. Like the Vaxi PA that I have here, for example. Normally it has a pretty moderate amount of static friction that adds a lot of stability to your play. But with Lethal Skates, these small interhand motions, especially when you're moving the mouse from a standstill, it feels much more like a speedy pad. Like it completely changes how this pad feels. And then with a pad like the GPZ1, this normally has a wrist-shatteringly high amount of static friction. It is insane how muddy this pad feels, but with the Lethal Skates, that all goes away. You still feel a little bit of tug moving your mouse from a standstill because once again this pad is very extreme, but it is a massive difference from traditional mouse skates, so no matter what you use you will have a feeling of relatively low static friction. So in a way it feels like glass skates normalize pads a little bit. All these little subtle differences in static friction start to go away, and every pad will start to feel like more of a speedy option during these types of movements. So if you want the feeling of effortless interhand motions, these are the feet for you. It feels like there's absolutely nothing in the way of your correction aim. All of your hand movements get directly translated into actual in-game cursor movement. This is something that they will start to feel on very fast pads, so it is cool that glass skates are able to replicate some of this feeling. This effortless cursor movement is also what makes this pad a very natural fit for tracking. You can make very precise, clean movements with your fingers, and you feel absolutely no restriction when changing directions to react to a target's movement. These feet really feel extremely solid for very tracking heavy games. And I think that's where most people will gravitate when using these, and what they will truly excel at for the vast majority of people. And overall, I feel that your mouse control can become quite excellent when you're using something that is this efficient. This very effortless, quick feeling has an extremely high theoretical ceiling, because on paper, you can only express your mouse control to its highest degree when you're not impeded by the surface or the mouse itself. So any extra friction, static friction especially, should only stand in your way. They will prevent you from being as agile, so you can't change direction as fast or adjust as quickly from a standstill. And all your flicks and fast movements will by default be slightly slower. So anything that can create an effortless feeling like glass skates do should have a very high ceiling on paper. However though, this is still all on paper, and in reality static friction isn't always bad for practical in-game aim. Pads like the Vaxi PA that I have here are great in-game, especially for tac shooters. I will absolutely stand by that 100%. It can add so much consistency to your play when you have the extra stability that some static friction brings. It has the capacity to remove jitters and clean up your aim when there's a little bit of resistance before the mouse gets moving. Smooth, clean lines should always be the first thing you develop when training your aim, and a surface with slightly higher friction could ease you into that a little bit. Plus, static friction helps to lock in your crosshair placement, which is most of your aim in tag shooters. Of course, you could still all do the same things on much faster glass feet, but it requires a lot of manual mouse control to reach the same spot that you would naturally get on a surface with high static friction. So if you're already shaky or a little bit inconsistent, it will only get worse on glass skates. This is something that is really important to consider. These will absolutely demand more of you to be on point and to achieve the same amount of performance that you would get on PTFE. And all of you should already know if your mouse control is lacking, so please be honest with yourself. If you're already shaky, already inconsistent, or just generally don't have very good pure mouse control, PTFE will most likely be your better option. And there's no shame here, personal preference is always key. What you should always look for is what you are most comfortable and confident with using, and not every product is going to be for everyone. So please, again, evaluate your mouse control before making this purchase. It isn't all doom and gloom though, because these feet are still controllable. This is largely because they keep a pretty high amount of dynamic friction. Like these actually feel pretty similar in speed to Zowie and Vaxi options on these large dynamic motions. And certainly they are noticeably slower than core pads and Tiger Ice especially. This makes it kind of hard to judge their overall speed in comparison to other options. If this low static friction is what makes a pad feel fast to you, then these will probably feel quite fast. But for someone like me, I normally feel that a surface is fast when it has lower dynamic friction. So I personally think that these skates feel kind of slow overall. But again, this really will depend on how you personally perceive speed, and know that a lot of people have different feelings about this. So anyway, this high dynamic friction allows them to have a pretty high amount of stopping power despite their very low static friction. This gives the feet a very snappy feeling that I quite enjoy. It is very easy to get your mouse moving and make a very quick movement, but then you're still able to have a very clean, very decisive stop right at the end of your flick. Once you start to get used to this, you will feel very snappy and very on point. It feels quite good, but is pretty unique and did take a little bit of adjustment period for me personally. This high dynamic friction and stopping power is also what makes these pads pretty viable for tag shooters. I did criticize them in this specific aspect earlier, but if your mouse control is good, it is a pretty nice fit for these style of games. You don't have that floaty, weird feeling with this mouse, so your corrections are very crisp. It's not slippery like you may think, and all of your movements have a very deliberate feel. It feels like there's a very smooth acceleration curve when you move your mouse from a standstill and slowly start to ramp up speed. It doesn't have this quick, awkward feeling acceleration curve that can sometimes make mice feel a little bit slippery and uncontrollable when you're making these small pixel movements. And then of course you also have good stopping power to get very clean stops during larger motions, so it feels excellent for click timing as well. It's pretty forgiving, and I feel like I could get a complete stop before I click, and overall make aiming much easier and much more simple. So once I got used to it, these actually became one of my favorite options for tag shooters in particular. Just be aware that, like I said earlier, these will feel pretty jittery, and I was extremely shaky at first. There was a fairly significant adjustment period, and I did have to specifically aim train smoothness on this mouse in order to even start feeling confident in game. But if you put in this work, it feels very good. Alright, now I want to go in detail on very specific pad combinations, because these skates will start to perform quite differently depending on what surface you put them on. So I want to be sure to go over a wide variety of pads that people commonly use. So what I think that most people will enjoy with these glass skates are these abrasive hybrid type surfaces that are kind of fast. Like the Hien, Hayatotsu, Venus, Mercury, Aqua Control 2, Strider, etc., the list goes on and on. These pads are a dime a dozen. So no matter what pad you use in this category, it should feel like a pretty natural fit, and these are what I went to first. So what makes these surfaces tick and what a lot of people enjoy about them is that they already feel pretty good for that correction style aim I was talking about earlier. They all have pretty low static friction and a little bit of texture that can add some extra feedback to your movements. This gives you a very precise feeling on your micro correction aim. And glass skates only make these feel better because it amplifies those same qualities. For example, the relatively low static friction they feel on all these surfaces becomes even lower with glass skates. So now it is even easier to make the small inner hand motions, and it has an extremely effortless feeling. This is very cool, and I could really see how a lot of people enjoy it, and I did have fun with this combination. But I did feel that this was a little bit too slippery because the static friction is legit so low. Like these types of pads were the ones that I was using when I figured out that my desk wasn't level, because my mouse would just slide across it very slowly. And that same level of slipperiness did translate to their endgame feeling. But again, if you do like that air hockey feel, this should be what you're going for. And in addition, these hard skates also feel good on these synthetic type fibers. It creates a very satisfying glide when rubbing glass against plastic, and it really is quite a premium experience. What I found is that the more synthetic-y and the more plasticky a surface feels, the better the glide feels as well. Also, these skates are not completely rounded, and there still is a little bit of an edge here. This allows them to retain a little bit of that abrasive texture and add some extra feedback when you're moving your mouse. This to me is what makes these types of surfaces the most satisfying, so I am very glad that these skates retain a little bit of that texture and abrasiveness. However, these very hard and very unforgiving skates do smooth out a little bit of the heavy texture on a pad like the Hien. It still feels pretty good in my opinion, but it does smooth out some of those deep ridges that does make this pad so satisfying for me personally. I just feel that it's a little bit lacking, and when I use the Hien, I really want to experience all of the texture I possibly can, and only something like core pads can quite offer that for me. And these glass skates just become a little bit too smooth to warrant using something as rough and harsh feeling on the skin as the Hien. So be aware that if you are a texture freak like me, you will lose a little bit of that with glass skates. So the hybrid surfaces were fun. What I actually preferred and performed better with in-game are these more balanced control type surfaces, like the Saturn, Extended Control, and in particular the Artisan Zero. In general, I like a little bit more control, and this offers exactly what I want. So what this combo does is that it is able to leverage how these feet retain dynamic friction to keep all the stopping power that makes these surfaces so good. I feel so locked in and so in control of these surfaces, it is an excellent feeling with these skates that create higher dynamic friction. However, this high friction does make a surface like the Saturn feel a little bit too sluggish for me personally, so the Zero is in a better spot for speed overall for my preferences. And just like I said with the Hien, these glass skates do also remove a little bit of the texture that I like so much on the Extend Control, so this pad isn't quite as satisfying to use. But again, the old Zero that I have here is much better because the surface is slightly abrasive, and I do get all of that feeling with these glass skates. It really does create a great balance of overall textural feedback as well as smoothness. So overall, the Zero is definitely my favorite out of these three options, and it would be my main surface for these skates in particular. Anyway, just like every other pad, these skates remove almost all static friction on these surfaces. This allows you to get the same benefits that you would on a speed surface, like these easy inner hand correction movements, but on a pad that feels much more controlled and relatively locked in feeling. I truly feel like you get the best of both worlds with this specific combo without making any compromises. This makes it super fun, and most importantly, high performing in game for me. However, this very low static friction does greatly reduce your stability at the same time, so you do lose that super locked in feeling that you would normally have on these surfaces. Just like I said earlier, I do certainly appreciate a good amount of static friction, so I did have to get used to it. This will always be the trade-off of glass feet, and even on these controlled surfaces, you will have to have a good mouse control and be able to control both a pad that is relatively fast and somewhat controlled at the same time. Make sure that you can already do this or are willing to learn it before buying these gates, please. Alright, now onto these smooth cloth control pads like the VaxCPA, GPZ1, Radar, Eclipse, Jupiter, GSR, Gigantus, Fury, etc, etc, etc. Initially, I thought that this would be a good combination, but in practice, I'm actually not that much of a fan. I thought that it should be nice to keep the stopping power that these surfaces are known for, but to also reduce a little bit of that muddiness that makes it hard to correct on these types. But in practice, it doesn't work well for my own personal preferences. And my main problem is that you lose every bit of feedback on these surfaces. If these skates are already very smoothed out cloth, then when you combine them with a glass skate that smooth out a surface even more, it is truly next level smoothness that I don't actually like. This is where a little bit of that floatiness that you probably expect with the glass skates start to come into play. Of course, it still is not uncontrollable floatiness, but it is far more than I would prefer or enjoy. And overall, it's just awkward. I lose almost all connection to my mouse when I'm moving it around in-game, which just feels weird and is something that I've never experienced before. I tried to get used to it, but I just could not, and I vastly prefer some extra feedback and just a tiny bit of texture, at least. But of course, this is all preferential, and if you do like absolute max smoothness, this should be what you go for. And if you are willing to look past some of that floatiness, this can feel like a very high-performing combination in-game. Then, my next issue is that these pads also start to feel a little bit sluggish for my personal preferences. Higher dynamic friction from aftermarket PTFE that I was talking about earlier makes these pads feel noticeably slower. And to me, it feels like I'm more dragging my mouse against these pads rather than getting that nice clean glide across it. And then finally, also lose that extra stability that makes these pads viable to me in the first place. The extra stability they get from the high static friction that these surfaces have is supposed to be the trade-off for that sluggishness that you feel of high dynamic friction. You do have to fight against the pad a little bit, but in exchange, you are very locked in and feel extremely stable in game. But when you use glass gates, even the slowest pads feel much faster on small movements, and almost all static friction and therefore stability gets removed. This makes them lose their charm a little bit and overall just feel kind of blah. It's like the normalization experience I was talking about earlier. It starts to bring these pads to have their own special unique feel closer to other options, which in turn takes away some of their identity and makes less of a reason to use them. Of course, this is still personal preference, and I need to keep emphasizing that because I can see some of the appeal of some of these bad combos. Like the Jupiter, for instance, could actually be viable if you want max dynamic friction but low static. This specific combination has a very unique feel that I could really see being cool for a lot of people. It isn't my personal favorite because it feels extremely sluggish and then also oddly slippery at the same time, but I could definitely start to see the appeal of someone who wants that combo and puts in the time to get used to it. Personally, I will have to test it out more when I start to do a full review of the Jupiter, but for now, it is very strange and honestly just quite awkward for me to use. So, in conclusion, glass skates are pretty cool. They have truly zero static friction, which is a very unique experience, but they're still very controllable in their overall glide. Plus, the extra smoothness that you get with glass is very satisfying. However, this complete lack of stability does demand more of you, so people who can't control their mouse well will perform worse. And for those people, these are not going to be the play, and you will absolutely be better served by PTFE options. So you really do have to be careful with these and make sure that you make an informed purchase decision. But if you do want to try them out, it is a cool experience and I can't recommend them just for that alone. Thanks all for watching, see you in the next one.